What do you think takes place in a society when we don't talk about things because we're afraid of being called racist, bigoted, homophobic, misogynistic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, or any of the other terms that are thrown out? What do you think happens when we don't address things because of that? Check out this clip from Jordan Peterson over here speaking at Oxford, and he goes through this in depth in this conversation that he's having. So we'll watch the clip together and then talk about it. But before you do, hit that subscribe button over there in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch. Check this out.
You frequently criticize what you see as a failure of the Western elites to confront difficult culture issues, particularly around mass immigration and its consequences. Now, when discussing grooming gangs in the UK, you have echoed concerns that authorities and media silence on this issue stems from the fear of being labeled racist or Islamophobic. Now, your commitment to individualism and individual responsibility, do you think it is fair or even productive to attribute these crimes primarily to culture or religious backgrounds rather than the failure of law enforcement or social institutions?
I don't think that question should be formulated with an or. It's an and. Like you attribute responsibility or blame where it's due. And it's certainly the case that a substantive amount of the blame should be laid at the hands of the authorities who failed to enforce the law and who didn't protect the young women, primarily young women, who were the victims of the gangs. And that's an appalling sin of omission. And responsibility and blame should be apportioned out to the people who turned a blind eye for whatever reason they did, for whatever multiple reasons they did, and equally, not precisely equally, more so for the perpetrators. And I don't really care who they are. I care about whether they're identified accurately, and understanding the reasons behind those actions is very complicated, and sorting out the relative contribution of hypothetical religious belief. See, I'm not really inclined to believe that people who sadistically rape young women are doing it for religious reasons. They might claim a certain degree of religious affiliation, but I think it's rather reasonable to be skeptical about such claims. And we have a problem. There's a problem, you might say, that besets communities of believers, whether they're secular or religious. You could think about this in terms of political affiliation or religious affiliation, independent of the content of the religion, at least for the sake of this argument. There's a subset of the population, psychopathic by nature, 3 to 4% generally of populations, and they'll use whatever form of camouflage they can possibly manage to hide the true motivations for their self-serving actions. And so psychopaths will use the utopian pronouncements of the left to further their own interest. I saw this frequently among the protesters that gathered around me in Canada. So at least at some times, they were often primarily young women for any number of reasons. I suppose they thought I was misogynist, partly because my audience tended to be more heavily male, but that was mostly because I'd picked up most of my audience on YouTube, and it's 80% male in its viewership. Anyways, the young women protesters were not particularly happy with me, and they were often accompanied by or led by men who were clearly there to prey on them, who were proclaiming their allyship with the oppressed women who I was tormenting with my patriarchal traditional presumptions. And they were there 100% to sidle up to these women and to take them for everything they were worth. And of course, they claimed their allyship, let's say, with the delusions of utopian feminists, but their fundamental motivation was sexual manipulation. And that's typical of psychopaths, because the psychopathic cluster B types claim victimization to mask their predatory machinations.
But the issue over here is that what we see is a cultural element that instead of focusing on victims, on solutions, on finding ways, the natural cultural war is that they are attaching it with ethnicities, targeting Asian minorities, that these are ethnic issues that causes these wars. So do you oppose that correlationship with ethnicity?
Not necessarily. I don't know what the causal pathway is. We don't know the relative contribution of economic class or of temperament or of cultural belief or of religious belief or the what would you call the claim of religious belief. When you see a problem emerge at that scale, the first problem you have is one of diagnosis. What's the causal pathway? Well, you can't take things off the table just because they're uncomfortable. Whatever the true causal elements are involved in the rape gangs, you can be bloody sure that uncovering them is going to make you uncomfortable, and seriously uncomfortable. And the easiest thing to do is going to be to brush it under the carpet. But everything you brush under the carpet grows new tentacles and comes out and attacks you when you least expect it. So it's not a very good idea. And no matter what factors we point to that produce that phenomenon, whose scope we don't even dare reveal, even to ourselves, every single bit of that discussion, if it's truthful, is going to make you as uncomfortable as you've ever been in your life. And so the probability you're going to do it with any degree of truth and clarity, generally speaking, is zero. And people are very much inclined to avert their eyes from the terrible truth, even when the catastrophe is virtually upon them. And you certainly see that proclivity for the blind eye make itself manifest in this rape gang scandal. So there isn't a comfortable diagnosis for that terrible series of occurrences. And so what that means is that if you speak about it at all, the probability that you'll be pilloried as some form of bigoted hate monger is 100%. So what are you going to do? Remain silent? Well, that's what's happened. So I'd say yes.
So I agree with you. We should not brush this under the carpet. And we do have some data available. According to a 2021 Home Office report, the 85% of the suspects were white.
85% of the suspects in what crimes?
In these grooming gangs, and especially child sex abusers. There have been 85% been white. The rest have been ethnic minorities. But the narrative, however, has been about race, immigration.
It's not the issue. The issue is that there's disproportionate representation of people by proportion of population. Percentage of perpetrators is irrelevant if the majority of the ethnic groups involved.
But before we get there, though.
Well, there's no before you get there. That's key to the question.
No, there is. Before we get there, I think the important issue over here is when we see such statistics, but more importantly, cases when it comes to a larger majority of the population, the framing does not come about ethnicity or race. It is completely an individual event. However, when it comes to minorities, then the framing is about ethnicity. That is the issue that I want to push you on. Why should we allow in terms of minorities, but not in terms of the majority population, which is white, that has been the suspected ones in these cases?
Well, if 85% of the population is white and 85% of the sex offenders are white, then sex offending has nothing to do with ethnicity.
Yes,
obviously.
Precisely.
But if 15% of the population is an ethnic minority and 30% of the crimes are caused by that minority, then ethnicity might play a role. And the statistic that you laid out didn't provide that information. So it's not relevant in the framing of the question. My understanding is that a disproportionate number of Pakistani Muslims in particular were responsible for a disproportionate number were responsible for this outrage. Now, why is that? Well, I don't know why it is, but I'm not willing to take any diagnostic consideration off the table because it's uncomfortable. As I already said, whatever diagnostic analysis you use is going to produce immense discomfort because the crimes were hideous and sadistic. And it's also the case that turning a blind eye to such things and failing to make the proper diagnosis is a trick used by people who want to virtue signal about their tolerance instead of bluntly confronting the problem and attempting to solve it. And that's not wise. So I'd rather do whatever's necessary to lay out the problem. We're so deceived about the problem that we don't even know how many victims there were. That's too blind. You know that you're terrified for whatever reason when you can't even specify the victim number properly, much less the number of, let's say, the number of rapes, the absolute number of rapes. I mean, I've seen estimates that vary by an order of magnitude. That's not an estimate. That's a guess made by people who've made themselves blind. So, I don't know, like, when I'm trying to assess a circumstance like that from the perspective of a clinical psychologist, I mean, I'd first look, as a psychologist, I'd first look to the psychological makeup of the perpetrators, and I'd certainly do that before I would look at ethnicity or cultural factors. I think that's only appropriate because sadistic rapes are probably undertaken by sadistic rapists. That's the simplest explanation, and that's actually a phenomenon that's best assessed psychologically. But that doesn't mean that issues of socioeconomic status or class or immigrant status or ethnicity or possibly even race, certainly proclaimed religious belief, and even possibly religious or political belief might also play a causal role. And that's a matter that can only be solved by deep investigation. And to build a causal model for something that complex usually requires a multivariate approach. You have to consider a large number of variables and their overlap. It's a very difficult thing to do, but you're certainly not going to progress in relationship to specifying the problem or understanding the solution by taking any of the potential variables off the table. And they've been taken off the table.
In Pirkei Avos of the Ethics of Our Fathers, it says, in the place that there is no man, you should strive to be the man. This means that when society fails to uphold truth and justice or responsibility, the individual must rise up with moral clarity, even if doing so is something that is uncomfortable or unpopular. Jordan Peterson emphasizes over here that moral deterioration begins when individuals abandon responsibility and truth in favor of ideological conformity, of victimhood, or the comfort of scapegoating others. Societal healing begins not with blaming others, but with brave self-reflection and honest speech. If you like this content overall, hit that subscribe button over there in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch. Take care.